Hi kids, and welcome to our lecture on plants. So let's start off recognizing where plants came from originally. When we learned the kingdom Protista, we learned that there were animal-like protists, the protozoa, that there were fungi-like protists, the slime molds, and that there were plant-like protists, which were the algae. So scientists currently believe that all modern-day land-dwelling plants evolved originally from plant-like protists, algae, that are still there today. So we think that green algae was the precursor to them. So how exactly did they move from the water to land? Well, in order to live on land, you have to have a lot of adaptations. You have to be able to store your food differently, especially water retention. When you're living in the water, you don't worry about that so much. But on land, you can desiccate or dry out very rapidly. So you have to have ways to obtain and retain water, which was the biggest difficulty that plants had. And then, of course, reproduction that wasn't reliant on water. And so when we look at modern day plants, some of the things we see is on the top of the leaves, there's this waxy coating. The plants that you see this more readily in is in cacti, in a cactus. If you run your finger across a cactus, carefully so you don't get pricked, a bunch of wax comes off on your fingernail. This is called the waxy cuticle, and it's there to prevent water loss. It's kind of like how you put chapstick on your lips on a cold day to keep the moisture in your lips. This is like chapstick for plants. The other thing they have developed are these things called stomata. Stomata are these little openings on the underside of a leaf that control water loss. So they open and close like little mouths. So they open, they let in the carbon dioxide, and then they close when they don't need to be open anymore. And so if you think about this in relation to our mouths, like I sit up here in class and I talk all day. Well, my mouth gets dry because it's exposed to the air and evaporation occurs. But if I close my mouth, then I'll retain some of the moisture within there. And that's essentially what's happening with our plants. The other thing they developed that aquatic plants do not have is a vascular tissue. All right, vascular means vein, like we have a cardiovascular system. So the veins inside the plants, they don't carry blood, thank goodness, because mowing the lawn would be very awkward. But instead, they have these two tissues called xylem and phloem. The xylem transports the water from the roots, where plants absorb it, up to the leaves, where it gets used for photosynthesis. Phloem, think of phloem food. This transports the food produced through photosynthesis, that glucose, C6H12O6, that's made during photosynthesis into all the other parts of the plant that need that energy source. So here's a diagram showing you in a carrot the xylem and phloem. So if you imagine yourself biting into a carrot, which hopefully you have done at some point because they're very good for you, you'll notice that the very center of the carrot is very moist, and it actually looks structurally a little different than the tissues on the outside. So this is your xylem. That's why it's so moist. That's where the carrot is absorbing liquids and moving it up to the little leaves that would grow on the top of the carrot. All right, your sugars in your phloem, they kind of move throughout the carrot. So that's all through all the tissues. So we have some different kinds of plants. We have non-vascular plants. These are the plants that don't have those xylem and phloem tissues, those veins in there. And these are called bryophytes. Bryophytes include mosses, liverworts, and hornworts, and I'll show you some pictures here in a minute. But because they don't have a way to transport water, they're basically getting all their water through osmosis, all right? It has to just dissolve through their cell membranes. And so they have to live in a very moist environment because they don't have any way to hold on to that water in large amounts. So they got to have water to transport everything. Reproduction is also reliant on water. So with your mosses do not reproduce until it rains. They get ready, they shoot up their reproductive organs, and then when it rains, they spit out their spores like little tiny bullets. With growth and development, because these guys do not have true tissues, they also do not have true roots, stems, or leaves. This is why you can take a clump of moss and pull up on it and it pull right off of the surface that it's attached to. Whereas if you try to do the same thing with a small tree, it's going to be a lot harder to pull it out of the ground because of that root system. It also limits their size because they're doing everything by diffusion and osmosis, so they can only get so big. and so they tend to be smaller plants. So this is what they look like, some little mosses, and if you look down in this bottom pictures, these little brown things sticking up that may remind you, if you've ever played Plants vs. Zombies, they look like the pea shooter, except these guys are actually shooting spores, not peas. And so if you're ever out in the woods and you see these and they're slightly brown, take your water bottle, drop a couple drops of water on there, and you might see some spores shooting out, and that's them reproducing. Then we got tracheophytes. So think tracheo, like the trachea in your throat. These guys have the tubes, so they have vascular tissue. And these include trees, shrubs, flowers, herbs, ferns. Most of the plants that we're most familiar with are tracheophytes. And we do have two kinds of tracheophytes. We have Gymnosperms and Angiosperms. And so how I have a little stupid science trick for remembering the difference between them is that your Angiosperms are your fruiting and flowering plants, and your Gymnosperms have your cones. So I just think Angie likes flowers, and there's cones in the gym. So like those orange cones, except these are pine cones. So Angie likes flowers, there's cones in the gym. So these guys have xylem and phloem. They reproduce by producing seeds instead of spores. They have this thing called alternation of generations, which we're not going to dwell on here. And because they have true tissues, they have true roots that absorb the water and transport it using the xylem, anchor the plant, store some water. They have stems that support and transport with the xylem and phloem, and then the leaves that can do photosynthesis as they absorb that water through the xylem. So there are a couple spore producers within this group that do have xylem and phloem, and these tend to be kind of more ancient plants, like horsetails were around in the time of dinosaurs. They do have xylem and phloem, and so they're not as reliant on water as like the mosses are, but they do belong in this group. And so club mosses that look like little tiny trees, and ferns as well. If you flip a fern upside down, you're going to see little black spots on it. That's their spores. Here's your gymnosperm, angiosperm thing. So gymnosperms, cone-bearing, and what's called naked seed, which means the seed is not in a seed coat like a sunflower seed is. We have to break that coat open to get to the seed. Instead, if you peel a pine cone open, the seeds are just right there. So these are any kind of pine tree, anything you would think of as like a Christmas tree, all right, is a gymnosperm. Angiosperms, the seeds are covered, all right, so they're in some kind of holding receptacle. They also can have fruit, so fruits or flowering plants all going together, and usually if you're a fruiting plant, you're a flowering plant anyways. So here are your gymnosperms, your cone-bearing, and again, when these are all peeled off, there's the little seeds right there. And if you think of your squirrels in your backyard love to tear these things apart, and what they're getting is those little seeds. Angiosperms are your fruiting and flowering plants. And like I said, if you're a fruiting plant, you probably have flowers. So this is a pomegranate up here, and on the end of your pomegranate, there was a flower. And after it was fertilized, the pomegranate is made out of ovary. Just like a woman's ovary, it grows. The seeds are the little embryos in there, or they're little already fertilized baby plants ready to go. And this flower will shrivel, and then eventually the fruit would fall off the stem, and then the babies would have this nice little thing to grow in. So here's showing it with apples. If you ever look at the bottom of your apple, the side opposite of where the stem is, this was the flower, and the flower was fertilized, and the apple is the ovary. So every time you eat fruit, you're eating the ovaries of the plant. And if you eat seeds, you're eating their little tiny embryonic babies. Okay, that'll freak you out. So this is a little flower that was left over there, same here down here, that gets shriveled up when it's not useful anymore. Then we need to do parts of the flower. So flowers are basically hermaphrodites. They have both male and female parts to them, which makes it really convenient for them to reproduce. So let's focus on the male parts first. The male parts are called stamen. It has the word men right in the name for the male parts. So the stamen are typically the parts, actually, besides the petals that we see the most. You have this long filament that comes up here. And at the top, it's this part that's yellow that when you touch it, it puts pollen on your hands. And this is the anther. So the anthers, you typically have many of them, and they produce the pollen. And pollen is essentially plant sperm. So this time of year, you're breathing in a whole bunch of pollen, and some of you have allergies, myself included. What we're allergic to is plant sperm. The sperm is inside this little case that carries around and keeps it from drying out. So those are the male parts, filament and anther, that makes the pollen. Now for the female parts, the pollen lands on, this is called the carpel or the pistil, it can also be called, but it lands here at the top of it, which is called a stigma, and the stigma is sticky, so sticky stigma. The pollen lands on that and goes down this little tube that is called the style. All right, and the style goes into the ovary, just like humans have ovaries. And in there are their immature eggs called ovules. And when the pollen hits and travels down, it fertilizes these ovules, and that's what creates seeds. So the center is the female part. Usually there's much less of these, most of the time just one, and many of the male parts. And then surrounding your flower are the petals. The petals are there to attract pollinators and to protect the reproductive organs of the flower. That's all flowers are for. They don't do photosynthesis. They're just there for reproduction. And these sepals are specialized leaves that protect the flower as it develops. And that's what you see when it's still a bud, where the flower is all wrapped up in these sepals to protect it until they're ready to go. When we look at our plants, we have what's called a cotyledon. A cotyledon is the first leaves that grow from your plant. Some plants initially grow with only one cotyledon, like corn, all right, and then it's only one seed leaf comes out at first. And then some plants grow with two cotyledons, two baby leaves, there they are right there, like this bean plant, okay? And so we call these monocots and dicots. So here we are with monocots and dicots. So we'll start with dicots over here. Dicots, two cotyledons. Their flowers are usually multiples of 4 or 5, so you could have 4, 8, 12, 5, 10, 15 petals. Their leaves are usually the easiest way to tell. If their leaves, the veins on them are net-like, then they are a dicot. All right, and then these things you don't even actually normally see, so I'm not going to focus on those at all. Over here with the monocot, only one seed leaf, their flowers come in multiples of 3, so 3, 6, 9. But the leaves are the easiest way to tell. These have parallel veins like corn. All right, if you ever shucked corn and you take those leaves off, they have those long straight veins. And again, I'm not going to focus on this part. So let's talk about how plants grow and how they move, because they do indeed move. So plants have this hormone called auxin. And auxin plays a big role in how plants move, because once plants germinate and have roots, basically how they move is back and forth following the sun. So auxin controls cell division. And so on the sides that have auxin, right, so the sides that have auxin are going to be those outside areas here. And those cells are going to reproduce and grow very long. And these ones are going to stay the same. And what that does is makes a curve, right? Like if you're a race car driver, you want to be driving on the inside of the curve because it's shorter and faster than the outside of the curve, right? So these guys have more cells over here. And what that does is pushes it towards the sun. So whatever layer is not facing the sun gets the auxin and pushes it towards the sun. Okay, growth towards light. We also have gravitropism, so it sounds like gravity, right? So this is movement in response to gravity. The plants can sense gravity, and they again do it using the hormone auxin. So auxin accumulates down with gravity in the roots, and so the cell division in the roots happen at the deepest part of the root. And then what that does is that's where all the cell division occurs. And so then the roots go deeper, which is good because they're usually going towards water, right? So the roots are showing what's called positive gravitropism because they're moving down with gravity. The shoots of your plant are going against gravity, so that's considered negative gravitropism. Right? So this is why when you plant your seeds, you don't pay attention to what orientation you put your seeds in the ground at. You just throw them in there and cover them up. Because the roots, if you look here, even if it's pointed out this way, will grow down with gravity. Even an upside down seed, the root will come out and then grow down with gravity, down with gravity. This one hasn't quite got there yet. The shoots will always grow up towards the light, showing negative gravitropism, which is something else. So shoots, positive phototropism, growing towards the light, negative gravitropism, because they're growing away or against gravity. The roots, negative phototropism, they're growing away from the light. Positive gravitropism, they're growing with gravity. So plants also move in some other ways. They have something called a thigmotropism. This is movement in response to touching something. So plants can actually feel in some capacity, not like us, but they can. And this is what vines do. This slow growth where they tendril around things that they touch and tend to grow up on a surface that's going to hold them upright because they don't have a stiff woody stem. That's why they can grow so fast. So that's thigmotropism. And then we have Thigmonastic. So let's think NASCAR again. We already brought them on once. So Thigmonastic is fast movement like NASCAR in response to touch. So this is what you see in your carnivorous plants and in some of the other ones as well. So a Venus flytrap will move very, very quickly. There's three little spikes that stick up inside there, and when the bug lands in, they hit 2 of those in succession, and then they move very quickly by moving water around in their vacuoles actually, and close up and grab that food item. There's also this plant, you could look it up, or I'll post a video for you somewhere about the sensitive plant that if you touch it, it moves, and that's an adaptation to keeping predators from eating you. So hopefully you learned some new stuff about plants here, guys. See you later. Bye.